And in case anyone, I didn't know that they started to do that. The like female computer robot voice that tells us that this meeting is being recorded.
It's really new, but yeah,
it's kind of creepy.
It scares me.
It is frightening. Big Brother is always watching. All right, so technological issues aside, we're only running 40 minutes behind here, and we had to switch to Zoom. But as Lance Goyke would say, the show must go on because we can't ignore the sunk cost of the 40 minutes that we have wasted. So let's jump in today. It'll be a quick one, 30-ish minutes or so. And I think a good topic to roundtable, one that I do want to come back on roundtable at some point, but that's going to be a much larger conversation, is to discuss the realm of stretching. So people can be on standby so we can kind of come back at some point and hopefully give a different insight onto why sitting around and just stretching your hamstrings, and people still do sleeper stretches, which frankly kind of blows my mind. But today I think it'll be good. We'll dive into, let's just think like weekly training splits in terms of how do we think about going about designing a training week, laying out lift days, conditioning days, etc., things in that realm. And as a quick backtrack, the reason I think this is important is it's really just getting into stress management, because that's essentially what we do for a living. We manage stress. We choose to input and apply stress to organisms at particular times and particular doses so that we can get some type of physiological adaptation and outcome. And when you think about designing and laying out a training week, I think that's a perfect example of how we're choosing and when we're choosing to apply stress on certain days. And one of the mistakes that I see a lot, I think we see when we're onboarding new athletes and bringing new people in, is that's being very mismanaged in terms of there's not an actual rhythm and flow or appreciation to the fact that I have a high day, I have a low day, I have medium days, whatever it's going to be. And people are just kind of generally like high-ish across the board. It's like, I'm just going to train and do something every single day without there being appreciation for kind of like a flow of a training week and what that needs to look like so that we can recover. Because I've always liked the bank account analogy. If you want an adaptation, you have to buy it. If I have a hard training day, I'm making a major withdrawal out of that bank account. So I'm going to have to figure out a way to put money, to put things back in that bank account so I can then buy an adaptation again. Right. So for example, if you have a training week and you just go lift, like those last 2 lift days, potentially 3, you're probably not really getting anything out of those days, right? Because we've essentially zapped the bank account the first few days, and now you've got nothing left. You're just training, right? Like this gets into that realm of people who just want to do work for the sake of doing work, right? So we'll get into some weekly training splits in terms of how to lay out a training week that I think work quite well for different types of outcomes. But just quickly want to throw that out there in terms of a roundtable if anybody has thoughts, inputs on this concept of like stress management, and in particular how we're deciding to apply a stress load over the course of a week.
I feel like there's many people, it's probably a good idea to just call names, because otherwise I'm just going to go first every time.
I think that's what we should do, because we've already talked about how Zoom clearly preferentially is going to show based off of muscle mass.
Yeah.
So I think we'll go with you, Meat Daddy. We'll let you lead the charge here.
Useless muscle mass. Yeah. So this is I like this. I like this topic because it can go a lot of different ways based on the goal, the training goal. So, like I live mostly in bodybuilding and some powerlifting as well. For bodybuilding, I've struggled with this one a lot over the years, because I think what I've ultimately come to the conclusion of is that bodybuilding isn't very hard. And I think that bodybuilders need to hear that. Like dieting really sucks. Getting ready for a show is a bummer. And, you know, it sucks not having boners for a while, but training wise, like it's not actually that hard. So I think that if there was ever a thing that looked like straight across the board, everything being very similar, it's probably bodybuilding, because you're not training probably the same exact body parts every day. So there is, in terms of the structure, and like if you're training on like RP for example, if that's how I tend to program things, the RPE may look the same as far as a set by set prescription, but there are definitely high and low days there. Like we know inherently lower body training is going to be much harder than upper body training just in general, right? So within that, you definitely have these higher stress days. And I think it would make a lot of sense. And I think bodybuilders do this intuitively anyway, where you're probably not going to do like a super heavy squat session followed by a super heavy squat session. That would be kind of stupid, but you might have a lower body session where you squat and it's a hard session. And then the next day may be a quote unquote hard upper body session, but it's not really the same level of stress overall. Right. So as far as the prescriptions go, it is a very high approach, but it's not actually that super stressful. So I think it still exists within that, but that's kind of the conclusion that I've come to, at least for bodybuilding stuff. And I think for powerlifting, it's definitely a little bit different, where it definitely makes sense to have, there's very big differences in terms of the training stresses, and it looks a lot different on paper. Maybe again, set by set, like I think taking a set of Zercher squats to an 8 RPE is much different than taking a low bar squat to an 8 RPE. So even though that's the same prescription, it is a very different outcome and a different stressor. But and then of course, like throwing in the cardio days, I think is really useful from a recovery standpoint, and just maintaining overall health and not just being a complete cement block. That kind of stuff is really useful, but that's where I'm at with it. I don't know if anybody else wants to chime in on something that's a little bit more interesting than being a complete meathead.
Yeah, one thing, I'll make a quick distinction here and then pass it off to anyone else, which is, I think the distinction here that's really important that you mentioned in the bodybuilding realm is, what does that individual training day look like? Like, are we actually doing upper lower splits where we're saying, okay, on today I'm having upper days, on today I'm having lower days. Maybe this is like a rear delt lat day with biceps, etc., versus like the majority of the programs I write, like where it's total body every time we lift. I think like that distinction is really important, because like you could have a hard lower body day and get torched, but you're probably okay to come in and follow that up with some type of an upper body input and stressor, because that shouldn't be carrying lots of fatigue left over from yesterday.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Like, so I was just going to say, like, I think if we have this total body approach where, like, for my people, it's like we're doing upper and lower on pretty much every lift day, versus saying we're able to have upper lower splits. I do think that's a really important distinction here in terms of when we think about laying out these training weeks and how you can stack your days together.
Mm-hmm. I was going to ask, Meat Daddy was, so how you're talking about, like, sometimes we distinguish like an athlete split as like, the high low traditionally from like the nervous system standpoint, but do you think the frequency can be so much higher for a bodybuilder's like lift days, or like, I don't know if like pseudo high days would be like the way to put it, because you're never truly getting, like, you're going to have hard shitty days, right? Where you're like pushing like your heavy low bar squat or whatever. And obviously your lower body days are going to be a little harder than your upper body days. But do you feel like the frequency can be so much higher for those, because you might not necessarily be tapping into like a traditional, like high neural day or whatever you want to call that?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I think an upper lower split is just one example. That actually isn't even something that I traditionally run all the time for hypertrophy people or myself. I tend to run more full body splits. And it really, to me, it just comes down to, it's the exercise selection in my mind. That's the biggest factor. And I would guess that it's probably similar with a lot of athletics too. Like certain things you just can't push as hard, or there just isn't as much of a cost to them. So you could definitely leg press or fucking leg extension the day after you do a really hard squat session and probably have very little negative effect from that. And you're definitely not going to, I don't know, like implode on the leg extension machine. Like, I don't think anything really bad's going to happen typically. And if there was something bad that was going to happen, you probably know. So yeah, like you can still definitely afford to spread that stuff out more, but I think it's just because of the exercise selection. And with bodybuilding in particular, like you just have so many options that just aren't so systemically taxing and like largely axially loading type of exercises. So you have all these options where you can do things pretty safely and, just dissipate that stress throughout the week.
Nice.
Yeah, Lance, do you want to jump in? I know you were going to go there.
I don't have a whole lot to talk about there, but I mean, I just want to second. I mean, I don't work with bodybuilders, but I work with high performance professionals in their careers, and it's the same idea. It's just like, I mean, party is like, do I even need to waive this microcycle because you're going to miss next workout anyway? Yeah. At least when I'm training people in person. But the exercise selection is a big deal. Charlie Francis talked about that forever ago, just with his high and low days. It's like, and he put a number, and I can't remember the numbers, but he was just like, a max sprint day is basically 100 out of 100. And a max clean and jerk is a 95, snatch is a 94, your squat's an 85. And we look at a squat and we're like, God, that's tough. And I feel worn out after that. But, relative to max speed sprinting workouts from people who can squat 600 pounds, like it's nothing.
Yeah, I would second. I think Charlie Francis is the background of this concept for me. Just right. If people haven't read Charlie Francis, go out of your way to do it. I would highly recommend. It's like $20, whatever it is. It's worth, buy it. But he talks about the high-low split with sprinters, essentially going along the lines of, like, if you're going to try to get faster, you need to be running at least over 90% at a minimum. Like, you've got to be over 90% effort. And the problem he saw was that you had a lot of people doing work between 70 and 90% output, which for a sprinter is frankly a waste of time, because the concept is pretty simple. Well, to get faster, I need to be over 90%. If I'm doing work between 70 to 90%, I'm not getting faster, but I am doing enough work to make sure I'm not recovering. Right. So the idea was just, hey, we're either working over 90% or we're going to do tempos and we're going to be beneath 70% so that I'm getting some type of improvement in work capacity. I'm able to recover, and then I can go back into my next sprint day. And so you can kind of take that and extrapolate it out to the weight room. The percentages don't carry over, obviously, but we can have a similar concept when we train in a weight room to say, okay, like maybe like the one that I like the most would be like a 3-3 split, where I lift on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Those are going to be high days. On Tuesday and Thursday are my low days. I'm doing tempos, I'm doing cardiac output, I'm doing low intensity circuits, right? And then Saturday is going to be another high day where I'm chasing some type of high conditioning, right? I'm chasing power or capacity, but doing it in a very intense way. And then I have Sunday as an off day. So I don't mind the Friday, Saturday, back-to-back high days, knowing that Sunday is a complete day off to chill and rest before I come back again on Monday. Again, this kind of depends on the outcome you're chasing. I tend to get people who want this hybrid total approach. So we're chasing like a lot of different outcomes simultaneously. And I found that layout to be the most successful. Ryan, Patrick, what are your thoughts here? Because I know that you see like a pretty wide range of like gen pop out to pro guys, out to like strongman powerlifting. I know you've seen a large realm as well.
Yeah. So I kind of want to dig into some of the stuff that Meat Daddy said too. But, to your point, James, we follow a 3-3 split quite a bit. Friday, Saturday are definitely 2 high days. Some of the different terminology is like the stimulation day versus the developmental day, where Friday is high-ish. At least we're going to use relatively high intensities, maybe not as high a volume as other lifting days, because we know Saturday we're going to be doing our max sprint stuff. So it's more of a primer in the sense that, I just want them kind of stimulated going into that Saturday session. So that's where we fall with most of our stuff. But, I can remember even going back to Silverback and talking about, you've got that main lift on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And I had no troubles with that. It was that other block of doing a trio of exercises that were more metabolically fatiguing, or at least in that rep range, the 10s, the 12s, that I really struggled with. And so, Ryan, since I don't work with a lot of bodybuilders, usually the guys that I'm trying to get to put size on are at least athletes. So there's still a priority there of strength, power, speed. But I may use something like a 2 kettlebell, rear foot elevated, split squat, because from a perception standpoint, it's incredibly difficult, but the actual loading that they're using is nothing. So I hate to say functional exercises, but what role or how do you even make space for that stuff? Because I would assume you're trying to accumulate as much tonnage as possible without any negative consequences. So do those exercises even have a place in terms of how you allocate some of that training stress?
Yeah, I think so. As long as they can do them without so much cognitive burden that it takes away from their ability to produce some output. Because the output, to your point, is not going to be super high, but as long as on the local level they're getting a huge stimulus there, as long as they're getting mechanical tension at the local tissue, like it really doesn't matter how much load is on their back. And ideally, yeah, the less load, the better. But it can be taken too far. Like I think a decent example is just some of the squatting stuff that has come up in our sphere over the last couple of years. And I think that can go a little bit too far, where it's you're so limited by the position and trying to maintain this stacking. And if you're doing that, if that's I think it's super beneficial. I think it's going to lead to longevity in the end. And it is a different stimulus, but I think there's so much cognitive burden associated with it and there's so much work just holding the position, especially for someone who already has a significant amount of muscle, that I don't know that that's going to be your huge bang for your buck exercise. But I like something like a double front rack split squat. Like I don't see any reason why that wouldn't be able to produce a lot of mechanical tension at the local level. If we're talking about like the quads, probably with that exercise, I don't see why that couldn't be a great exercise. And they're also getting this different input that isn't just like trying to survive under a heavy load for once. I think that, I don't see why that couldn't work. And I try to utilize that stuff as much as I can, assuming that they can actually get into, like, can they maintain some semblance of a stack? Can they get into a hip shift with that exercise? Are they able to like actually stay centered over that femur? And like typically they can figure that out over time. So,
yeah, I think an important distinction here is, and I'm glad this got brought up, right? Because if we think about choosing an exercise, there's realistically 5 outcomes I could be chasing from that exercise selection. Like I'm either trying to get strength, hypertrophy, power, endurance, and or capacity, or I'm trying to create a movement-based change. And I think like people need to, I just put something out on Instagram today about this actually. It's like you need to start with the outcome first. I think this is why this is so important. It's like, what outcome do I want out of this movement? And then work your way back to what exercise can deliver in that outcome, right? It's like a wall-supported one-leg RDL is a great example. Not going to really build strength, not going to get hypertrophy, definitely not building power. I'm giving that as an exercise because I'm trying to get a movement-based change. I'm trying to improve movement competency in some realm in a hip hinge pattern, right? Maybe you get some capacity changes depending on like how well trained or detrained this individual is. But like I put like the 2 kettlebell front rack split squat in a similar realm because you're so capped in terms of your total load. It's like, that's where I'm thinking maybe more movement and some capacity based changes, right? But what we do know, and we've talked about this before, like this nice flywheel effect when we use that more sensory motor work, like when we get those movement based changes, it just flywheel feeds into your big lifts where I am chasing strength, hypertrophy, and power. And it allows you to get more out of those movements. But I think like you have to ask that question first of what's the outcome I want, get really clear on that, and then choose the exercise that best can deliver on that outcome. And
I think that's I'm going to jump on that, James, because, I think some of the better programs, or at least in terms of the structure of the entire thing, is not trying to do it all in a single program. And I think anybody who writes their own program has a tendency to kind of overestimate. I write shitty programs for myself.
I overestimate for myself. I'm like, I'll write it out. I'm like, oh, I totally got this. And you get like halfway into the session, you're like, oh, this is a terrible idea.
And there's times where guys have written programs. I'm like, man, this is much more difficult than I thought. But I mean, I'm ridiculous. I'm just out of this world. So I think, really sitting down and looking at not just what to include, but what to exclude has been one of the more beneficial things that actually makes the program, I think, very succinct in delivering. Because one of the things that I try to do on some level is a bit of redundancy. Like if there's a certain adaptation that I'm trying to drive, I want a little bit of integration of that concept throughout the session. So specific to an athlete, the warm-up may have certain movements that, let's just say, open the hips for some lateral or change of direction stuff. There may be a med ball throw that integrates and further preps that. There may be movement-based work that looks like that. And then we may even do something strength-oriented, like a lateral lunge or split squat, where I'm just really trying to drive that specific adaptation. So on some level, I want that. And it just, when I decide what I don't want, it's a lot easier to get those changes.
100%. And I think one thing I do want to circle back to is Lance brushed over this, but I do think it's really important because I think a lot of people end up like way overthinking this sometimes, right? So depending on the population that you're working with, depending on you and your goals, right? Like if you're a really busy professional who's not training 4, 5, 6 days a week, right? Like this conversation is probably less important for you, right? Because it's like, all right, if my concern is like getting in 2 to 3 good days or maybe 3 to 4, like we're not trying to like juggle this stuff as much, right? And so I would love to turn that over to Lance because like you work with way more of these like high performing professionals, people that are super busy, right? The major type A, like CEO types who are already probably working outrageous hours, don't sleep well, and then they just want to go mash and train hard all the time. And so you're kind of having to play a balancing act there. But like with these people where we are on a time crunch, it's like I think the weekly split, the stress management conversation shifts a little bit from a lot of people we get where it's like the gym is the priority. I'm going to get there all the time. I'm going to train 6 days a week. So we have like a spectrum to play with here.
Yeah, where to start? So I don't work with a lot of the ubiquitously type A professionals. I work with the people who their job and their family are their priorities, and they want to be healthy. And that's the end of that thought. Mm-hmm. So there's a weird balance because they don't have the physical stress of like a 3-3 kind of weekly programming. But they do have the physical stress of, their eyes are always converged on something 16 inches away from their face or 12 inches away from their face if they're on their phone. And their mind is always going. So you have, I'm sure we've talked about this at some point, but stress is general. All stress is just stress. But those stresses react differently. I think one thing, on the topic of this conversation that people overvalue is the local stress. Like your tissues, oh no, I shouldn't squat today because I squatted yesterday. It's not that. It's that your body just can't handle it. It's not like your legs are tired, mm-hmm. And they feel sore and they don't want to do it. And so it's a little overvalued, I think. But what we're talking about is a general overload of the CNS, the brain and nervous system. So with these professionals, right? So I got one guy who's been at Google for 15 years. And you can imagine he's pretty busy, right? And he's super smart and he can't stop thinking about stuff. And his job is he's a designer and he says, this is how we are going to make things because I've thought about everybody who's going to use this and they need it to be this way. There's a lot to consider there, right? So he doesn't have the stress of working a 3-3 week, but he does have the tension, the descending CNS drive that is stress, and stress is general. So I want to give him something hard, something that's going to stress the local tissues, right? Get those adaptations. But with his, bulging disc nerve issues that he's got, with his sensitivities in his back, and just with the neck stiffness that comes from looking at something really close to your face all day, or the back stiffness that comes with it, or the back stiffness that comes from standing in one spot or sitting in one spot all day. I have to consider that. And I have to consider that training, though important, and I want it to be as efficient as possible, is not always a priority for this person. So even, with someone like that, I could have somebody that I train twice a week and I could still give them an easy day. Just because I don't want them to break down. I'm trying to support what they're trying to do, which isn't necessarily to squat 400 pounds or whatever.
And it's a long-term game.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like that's one that people need to always come back to, is that we're always playing a long-term game. You're never going to get better from one day or 1 week of training. You're just not. You can get a whole lot worse from 1 day or 1 week of training. But it's like you get better because of the fact that you've been consistent for 12 weeks, 16 weeks, 6 months, 1 year. Like that's where the progress takes place. People will just become so short-sighted and narrow, they try to pack as much as they can into a single training week sometimes. And I'm like, well, yeah, no wonder you're not going anywhere. You're not seeing progress because like you have nothing in the gas tank. You have nothing in your bank account. You're just running on empty. And that's where I think a lot of times people get frustrated because like, well, I thought I just had to work hard and that would get me what I want. Like just go to the gym and work hard and sweat and suffer and I'm going to get the changes I want. And it's this weird dichotomy also of when you first start to train, you get rewarded for that behavior because you're new and everything you do makes you better. Right. But then it's like the longer you train, the more we really need to be thoughtful about what day goes when. Why is that day there? How does that fit into this week? How does that fit into this month? How does that month fit into these 12 to 16 weeks, et cetera, right? And so the templates that I always have in my mind, because I'm thinking about these 5 outcomes, strength, hypertrophy, power, endurance, or movement. It's like, okay, if I'm trying to create more of a movement-based change, and Lance, I actually got this from you because this was the very first program you ever wrote me when I was super broken and interned at iFast. Right? It's a 2-1 split, but it's a repeating 2-1 split. So you have an A day, B day lift. So you'd like lift Monday, lift Tuesday, condition Wednesday, lift Thursday, lift Friday, and then maybe condition again on Saturday. But you're repeating that A day, B day lift. And I think that's super important when we're trying to chase primarily a movement outcome because you need the increased exposure. You need more reps. You need more learning opportunities. Right? And then I think if you want this total package approach, I don't think there's anything better than the 3-3 split we've already talked about. If you're more interested in strength and hypertrophy, like this is where I think we live in the realm of a 4-2. You have 4 lift days. You're going to have 2 easier conditioning days and spread them out, right? Maybe lift Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, condition on Tuesday and Thursday, right? That's pretty simple. Like Louis Simmons made that popular way back in the day with his West Side splits, right? And then if you really wanted to push it in that realm, I think this gets more into that power building concept, right? You can go a 5-1, have 5 lift days, 1 conditioning day. But as we start getting more into that realm, that's where we need to get into more of the specialization that you talked about earlier, Ryan, in terms of like, we really need to start getting good about upper lower splits, appreciating like local fatigue in that realm, right? And then if you really want endurance, like I think a 2-4 split makes the most sense. You have 2 lift days, you have 4 conditioning days, right? And your conditioning days are going to be high or low, right? So in my mind, when I'm laying out these weeks, and you can do it on a graph, I think it really helps, right? Just write stress on the y-axis, put your days of the week on the x-axis, and then just categorize the day as a high or a low. And you should see a natural up and down rhythm to the week. If your line is just going straight across the graph, probably time to like reflect and maybe make some changes, right? Like generally speaking, my base recommendation is like, I found it's really hard to have more than 2 high days in a row. My own personal experience for myself and the athletes I've coached, right? But I also am not in the bodybuilding hypertrophy realm where I think you can probably break that rule and still be really successful. But generally speaking, if we're doing more of this total body athlete approach, if you're doing more than 2 high days in a row, I think you're playing with fire. Just my 2 cents there. don't know if you guys have any thoughts there in that realm in terms of like the layout of the weeks, the splits. Because yeah, like you want to pick the right split to match your goals, right?
I think we all agree. That's why we're here hanging out.
Everyone's just hanging out. I know. So, like Ryan, I've done some of your hypertrophy programs, and you tend to live more in that 4-2 realm, and even like Lexner's living with us now. He's right through that wall over here, right? And like, so he's very heavy entrenched in the bodybuilding realm right now, and he's on more of that 4 lift days a week. And he even gets a little bit more spaced out than that sometimes. Like I was talking to him recently and he said that's one of the biggest adjustments that has been made over the last 6 months. He's like, yeah, I'm actually training less, but like I'm getting far better results. And I think people are generally blown away how that works.
Yeah, I think it can work. I think it has to be, what's that word? Where things come before it. I don't know. There's a fancy word.
Subsequent?
Yes, thank you.
I'm there for you, bro.
Well, what's before that? Well, subsequent, whatever. Okay. So before you do that lower frequency thing, it's going to drive me fucking nuts. I hate when this happens. But before you do that the lower frequency thing, I think it helps to start preceding with with a higher frequency or higher volume training cycle. And I remember hearing like just like bodybuilders talk about that, like when they switch, like old school guys, like when they switch to like the one set, like Mike Metzner stuff, where he just does one set, but he came from like a super high volume training phase. And I think it makes a lot of sense to have these cyclical type of programming structures where there are really high volume phases followed by some lower volume phases where you can actually realize this. It's just super compensation. Like it's been around in every sport for forever. So I think that it does apply to hypertrophy as well. It does seem to be like there is some evidence to like this delayed hypertrophic response from training as well. And I think sometimes you do need to pull back. But I say that because I think people can hear that and they're like, shit, I just need to train less. I'm like, motherfucker, you only train once a week anyway. Like, so that's where I think like, I think it needs to come with some context. Lexner is a absolute behemoth.
He's very advanced. Like,
yeah. Like
he'll be more advanced than 99.9% of people listening to this. So let's keep that in context. That's important.
For sure. But there definitely is something to be gained by pulling back every now and then. At the very least, psychologically, just knowing like, all right, I've been training 6 days a week for a few months, and now I'm going to pull back to 4 or 3 or something. Like, you're just going to feel
you're gonna feel like a rock star.
Yeah, you're gonna feel great. And I think that at the very least that's really nice to walk in the gym feeling like that, and just in life in general, just feeling not as beat up.
There's a phenomenal one-liner from the movie The Other Guys. Have you ever seen that movie?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I'm trying to remember what it is, but it's just like phenomenal. They're like sitting in this little support group talking about, if people haven't seen that movie, go out of your way to watch it. It's hilarious. Will Ferrell and Mark Wahlberg, but they're talking to these people about recovering from the trauma of like shooting their gun in the line of fire. But all the cops in there, these like super macho dudes. And so he's telling the story about how he like comes in, like blasts this dude in the chest with a shotgun. And like the therapist's like, well, how does that make you feel? Guy's like, made me feel like my cock was made out of concrete. Something along those lines. All right, so let's wrap this here. So let's wrap it. Let's just go one by one. If there's going to be one thing that you want someone to walk away with, what's the one takeaway? What's the one action item that they can actually go use? Let's go reverse order with how people are on my screen. So we'll go Ryan Patrick first, Lance, Meat Daddy.
Yep. For me, it is definitely just have intense prioritization of what you are trying to accomplish within the context of a training program, a training block. I know we spent a lot of time just talking about the layout of a week, but the training stress fluctuates over a period of time of sessions and how your body responds. I know for me, very few things that I've ever written have gone to script. I mean, we're trying to basically plan how your body's going to respond weeks out. And, you know, I have kids and my wife owns a business too. And I mean, there's just an immense amount of variables that can impact how I'm going to recover. for any given session. So, understanding really what you're trying to accomplish and make sure that you get the big rocks in the training program, I think is one of the most valuable things.
Yeah, I'm totally with you there. I want to say, pick the thing that is the single priority, but that's kind of what Ryan's saying. So I'll offer a different kind of piece of advice. For those of you who think that you need to take it easy that day, warm up before you decide.
I like that.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. Don't be so tied to your HRV in the morning. That's probably actually not that accurate to begin with.
I hate this.
Yeah.
I would never.
I went
get out
the
of
exact
bed.
opposite with that. I'm like, I'd get a red reading. I'd be like, well, let's see about
It's
that.
going to be a good day. Yeah. Those are always the best days, dude. Fucking red's a badass color as far as I'm concerned. I love that. That's great. James, actually, I love the charting it out thing. I don't remember which is the X and which is the Y on the axes, but having the stress look like this. And I think I'll just speak mostly to the bodybuilding side of things, but use your exercise selection to determine the stressor and how great it's going to be that day. You don't, when you start hearing about high, low, just remember you're not all that sophisticated as a bodybuilder. Okay. Like you're not an Olympic sprinter. So like you can definitely use high, low concepts, but that doesn't mean that you have a day where you go in or multiple days in the week where you're training out of 15 rep and reserve. Okay. So like your exercise selection is really going to be the thing that determines the stress overall.
Yeah, I think when you start getting more in that specific hypertrophy bodybuilding realm, if we're going to start drawing this graph, you need to add another layer onto what you're writing in. Because I'm always thinking what Lance mentioned, more of this general total fatigue, general total stress, because that's more in the realm of how I'm applying stress. But in your realm, I would imagine on that graph, it would be helpful to say, oh, this was a high day, and it was a high day for these body parts. Right.
Exactly.
And then I can go to another day, but maybe it's high again, but now it's a high day for different body parts. And if you're going to do a total approach, you can say, okay, well, these body parts were high on this day, so they should be low on the following day, right? It's like, I'm going to do a knee extension instead of a hack squat, et cetera. So I think that would be a helpful layer to bring for people who are more interested in the bodybuilding hypertrophy stuff. Let's see. My one takeaway, I think, would be a combo of everything that you guys said. Like, you need to get super clear on what your goal is and then pick the right weekly training split for that goal or that outcome. That's kind of step one in the process. Like, don't just wing it. There should be a natural flow to how you experience stress over the course of a week. And then this same concept can be pulled out and talked about in terms of full training cycles, phases, blocks, et cetera. You can use a similar graph approach to see how it all comes together. But sit down, take the time, like draw it out and write it out. Because it'll be, I think, really helpful for the people listening that are more into that total package hybrid approach. If you haven't been doing the 3-3 split, I would switch to that immediately. Just from my experience, I've found nothing that works better, and it works all the time, and it's like absolute gangbusters. Sweet. Thanks for hanging with me today, guys. Have a beautiful week, everybody. Technological issues aside, I hope that you enjoyed the episode, and we'll be back next Monday.